Hello, everyone. My name is Wesley Livesey from the History of the Second World War podcast. Join me on a journey through the most destructive conflict in human history, a journey that will take us not just through the famous campaigns and cataclysmic battles, but also to the lesser well-known corners of the war that touched millions all over the world, as we try and answer not just the questions of what and where, but how and why. You can find History of the Second World War on all major podcast platforms or at historyofthesecondworldwar.com.
Hello, and thank you for listening to the History of World War II podcast, episode 486, Robert Hutton interview, The Illusionist, the true story of the man who fooled Hitler. Robert Hutton spent 16 years covering the British government for Bloomberg and has worked for the Mirror and the Financial Times. His previous books include Agent Jack, the true story of MI5's secret Nazi hunter, and Romps, Tots, and Boffins, the strange language of news. His latest book, The Illusionist, covers the story of Dudley Clarke, a man who realized that military deception could be run on a scale no one imagined possible. And during the early war years, the British needed all the help they could get as Nazi Germany won battle after battle, country after country. Until the Allied war machine is ready to take the offensive, it's time for a bit of sleight of hand. Mr. Hutton, thank you very much for joining us today.
Absolute pleasure to be here.
So I just want you to know, loved the book. I burned through it in like 3 settings, and it reminded me once again just how desperate the British were during the early war years. And if you can't fight your enemy and you really don't want them to attack you yet, maybe you deceive them, you trick them, you do anything you can to stall for time. And that's the crux of your book. So again, I just want everybody to know this was a ripping read and I enjoyed it very much. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Well, that's lovely to hear. Thank you.
Absolutely. So let's jump into this. So, and I've seen this. This must be like the 8th time, and I don't know if it's something about the British culture or the time period. I'm not sure, but there are people that come to their full selves in only strange or extreme situations like war, where the normal rules of civilized life are suspended. Some enjoy killing. I know that sounds cruel, but it's a reality. Others enjoy the idea of being a respectable scoundrel, doing something that the gentleman would not normally do. A pirate, if you will, but of course, while defending their country. And Dudley Clarke, the main character of your book, was one of those people. Could you introduce him to us, please?
Dudley Clarke is one of these characters that sort of pops up in the history of the British Empire. That he's a little bit of a rogue. He's a little bit of an adventurer. Right. His father was a rogue, really. He'd sort of gone to South Africa in the end of the 19th century to seek his fortune, gets involved in a coup, gets away with it, makes money in gold mining, and comes back to Britain and begins what looks from the outside like a respectable life of an English gentleman, but you get the sense that Clarke Senior was never quite, an English gentleman.
Yes.
And Clarke, he sends his sons to Charterhouse School, which is a leading English private school. It's a sort of place that educates. It educates, in fact, the men who are supposed to be going to run the empire, generals and bishops and members of parliament. Our last Chancellor of the Exchequer in Britain was a Charterhouse man. Mm-hmm. My father was a Charterhouse man. Right. Yes, so there's this veneer of respectability. But in fact, Dudley Clarke is born 1899, and so the dominant thing of his teenage life is the Great War, which breaks out in 1914. And in fact, he always said he was very proud that he was in uniform at the point at which the war broke out, because he was part of the Charterhouse cadet force, which is a sort of way that schoolboys were trained to be soldiers. And they were on camp that August. and they noticed that the professional soldiers who were sort of supposed to be training them started to disappear.
Right.
And then one morning they were told that war had broken out and they wanted to go home. And sort of for them, it feels like a great adventure.
Yes.
And they're all desperate to get into the action. And I mean, it's sort of tragic because large proportion of the boys who were with him at that camp would be dead within 4 years.
Right.
Dudley is desperate to get to the front, and he tries all sorts of tricks. He tries to join the Navy. He doesn't know it at the time, but I think his father blocked him from that. He joins the army, or tries to join the army, and initially is told that he hasn't passed the officer's exam, and then to his delight, he's told that they've lowered the bound they've lowered the pass mark. And what he doesn't understand, again, at the time, is that this is because they're losing so many officers at the front that they just need to start training more. So as a teenager, he goes to the Royal Military Academy to learn to be an artillery officer, but he's still too young to be sent to the front. He tries joining the Royal Flying Corps and ends up getting sent off to Egypt to learn to fly, and he is on an airfield in Egypt when he learns that the armistice has been signed. And I mean, it sort of tells you something about him, that he burst into tears at that point because he wasn't going to get a war. And he felt he'd been cheated. But his father persuades him to stay in the army because he says, "Look, you'll have adventures there, and there's a shortage of jobs for all the men who are coming back from the front anyway."
Right.
And Clarke spends the next 20 years becoming the sort of the ideal staff officer in lots of ways. He's divided between Britain and a lot of the time in the Middle East, spends a lot of time in Palestine, and the kind of staff officer he is he's at one level, he's often borderline insubordinate. I mean, somebody said his attitude to orders was he either obeyed them or ignored them. And he shouldn't. The reason he gets away with that is because he's so good. He's the kind of person who, when you say to them, "Look, Dudley, I've been thinking, and maybe we ought to do something about problem X," he'll reply, "Well, actually, sir, I've already been thinking about that, and here are a few ideas I had."
Wow.
And if you're a general, actually, that's what you really want. You want someone like that.
Anticipation.
Sitting close to your desk, and so he sort of he catches the eye of lots of people.
Yes.
He's an impresario. He's sort of putting on shows in the military. He's fascinated by the theatre. He's fascinated by cinema when it starts to develop. He's obsessed with films. He buys his own movie camera so that he can try and make films. His younger brother actually will become one of England's leading screenwriters after the war. I think he wins Oscars for some of his Ealing comedies.
Wow.
But and actually, for all of Clarke's life, the famous Clarke was his little brother. So he's a storyteller, and he's an incredibly efficient staff officer, but he is a sideways thinker.
Yes.
He's somebody who approaches problems in a different way.
Yeah. I have to say, when I read the part about, he doesn't get into the war, they declare peace, and he's upset by that, the first thing I thought was the hubris of youth. But you really can't blame him because it's, it's exciting and dashing and all that stuff. But as I'm reading this part of the book, he spends time in the Middle East, he's on various staffs, he's just absorbing so much information, and he's getting all these experiences, and he's meeting all these people who will be generals and CNCs in the future who will affect his life. And it's almost like the word fate or something like that comes in, because even though he doesn't make it to this war, he is going to have a very outsized effect on the next war. He was just a sponge he was just, I don't know, just this bundle of energy, if you will.
Yes, and he's had exactly the right experiences.
Yes,
as he will discover, he will spend most of World War II in the Middle East, an area that he knows well, an area indeed that he has seen from the ground and the air. because that's where he was learning to fly, which not that many people have. He has got experience of airborne warfare, if not warfare, sort of. He knows how to fly. He knows how to see things as a pilot. He knows how things work on the ground. He knows how to tell stories, which is going to be tremendously important. His great work of deception is really sort of knowing how to tell a story to the enemy and make it look convincing. Theatre and cinema are all about making something look like something that it isn't.
Right.
And he knows both how to do that and how things ought to look because he's a staff officer. I think it's really hard actually to think that although there are in World War II lots of sort of gifted amateurs who come in and do amazing things, and I think we'll probably get on to some of them.
Right.
I think actually to do the job that Clarke did, where you had to be dealing with generals and you had to be telling stories to enemy generals, it's very hard to imagine that somebody who wasn't a career soldier could have done that. Yeah. And it's very hard to think what better background that career soldier could have had than the one that Clarke has between 1918 and 1940.
Very well said. And I don't know how apt this is, but you've got this young gentleman with this certain set of skills, his certain experiences. And this is the part I'm not sure about, but it's certainly a desperate Britain at that time. And, 40 and 41 were willing to go, you know what, at this point, we'll try almost anything. The very rigid tradition and stuff like that, but sometimes needs must.
Absolutely. I mean, it's one of these movie tropes of
right.
Is that somebody comes up with a whizzy idea and the top brass aren't interested, and almost always in the movie, what has to happen is that they have to work out a cunning way to get to the one man in the British establishment who will listen, and that's Churchill, and they get the message to Churchill, and he says, "Go." That's just not what happens.
Right.
That's sort of, in fact, the British generals know that they. It's also not that, are we losing the war in 1940? Well, we're certainly not winning it.
Right. Sorry.
And every time the British army meets the German army, the British army ends up running away. Yes. And that's true all the way through 1940, and it's true almost all the way through 1941. And so the idea that the British generals are absolutely desperate to hear. If anyone's got any bright ideas, please, now would be the moment. And
sorry.
Although actually, sort of one thing that someone said to me was the way that you find out who's going to win a war is who is getting through who's getting rid of their peacetime generals fastest. Ooh. when you get into war. All of these guys who have been sort of tremendously good at running the army when it doesn't have to actually fight anyone.
Right.
And some of them will be good at fighting, but a lot of them actually turn out to be a bit hopeless at that. Yeah. And what you need to do is very quickly get through them. And actually, Churchill was very good at sacking generals. I mean, some of them, I think, probably unfairly, but they churn through these generals very quickly. And the ones that you have who are running the war by, the middle of 1941, when Clarke goes to them and says, "I have got this idea," and as he puts it, "I have got this idea to win the war." With deception, they are very keen to hear from him. And again, it helps that they all know him, but they're keen to hear from him, and they say, "Yep,
right,
that sounds good. Go for it." So actually, it's sort of, I mean, it is interesting. The American generals in the book struggle a bit more with the concept of deception. And one theory is that strong armies don't see the need for it.
Right.
Yes. So Clausewitz, a great military theoretician, was very rude about deception, said it's not worth it. It takes any deception operation takes men that could more usefully be used elsewhere. Sort of there's this view that there's one story that when an American general is being briefed ahead of D-Day, that the Allies are going to say they're going to land at Calais, but actually they're going to land at Normandy, but they're going to tell the Germans that they're going to land at Calais, and he says, "But we're not going to land at Calais." and that's sort of it sounds silly, but of course, sort of the way that you win a war ultimately is by finding the enemy and fighting him.
Yes.
So it's no good if your soldiers don't meet the enemy.
Right.
Although Clarke's point was, actually, what if you could take, and this is his great insight, what if you could take enemy soldiers off the battlefield altogether, put them somewhere where they're not needed? And that was his great deception achievement, was the extent to which he managed to do that. But no, I think it helps Britain to be creative, that Britain is losing in the early stages of the war. I think that concentrates the mind tremendously on sort of, right, well, what can we do that will change that?
Well said. And that reminds me, that leads me to my next question. So when Dudley Clarke dies in 1974, there's not a lot written about him. And I think that goes back to what you were saying about this is, very unconventional. And then it dawned on me, if the British pull off something that we're going to go into a little later about what Mr. Clarke was able to do, you don't really want to talk about it in case there's another war. You might need to bring back some of the playbook. But I was surprised that there was so little written about him. So how did you find out more information for your book about him?
So you're right. First of all, when he dies, it's barely noted. He gets a sort of a 2 or 3 paragraph obituary in the Times newspaper that just says, this chap died, was an unconventional officer in the war, it says, and but it doesn't really say what or how.
Right.
And quite obviously, the newspaper had no idea who he was. He was sort of. No, he was not famous. If you had looked him up on whatever the 1974 equivalent of Google would have been, you would have found, well, he wrote a book sort of shortly after the war about some of the stuff he did in 1940. Right. So that's probably what they were working off. He was involved in founding the Commandos, which is, one of Britain's first special forces units. Mm-hmm. So they mentioned that, but absolutely nothing on his great work. And indeed, they did want to keep deception secret for precisely this reason. They said, we might do this again.
Right.
And the problem was that, in fact, because they kept it secret, they then sort of forgot that they'd done it, which is always the danger.
Yes.
I first came across him, actually, in 2013 when the government opened up a file on his arrest. Because he is arrested in the middle of the war in Madrid in circumstances that are still obscure. And he's arrested, crucially, walking down a street in Madrid, dressed, as it said in the report, down to the brassiere as a woman. And there are photographs of this. And this was sort of... Did we know about this before the files were released? I'm not sure what we. I think that there was a little bit of notoriety because people on the inside knew about it. In 2013, the government's opening up secret files, and they open up these files and present us with this picture of Dudley Clarke in a floral dress in a Madrid police station. And I, like everyone else, wrote a slightly sniggering news story about this sort of oddball British officer who none of us really knew what he was, as it were, why we should have heard of him. And the assumption was he was a crank rather than an eccentric, if you see what I mean.
Yes.
And so, yes, when I wrote the story and I didn't really understand who he was. And then... a few years later, when I was sort of digging around, I was actually looking into someone else, and I came across there's a book called Churchill's Wizards by Nicholas Rankin, which sort of does the whole from 1900 to 1945.
Wow.
Take on various sort of bits of deception and camouflage and so on. Mm-hmm. And I was reading that, and Clarke features quite heavily in the second half of that. And I thought, actually, do you know what? This chap's quite interesting.
Right.
I wonder what else there is. And then you go and you start digging, and you discover, he kept meticulous records, and they're all just sitting there in the National Archives in Britain. And you have to go and go and take them out, but you can go and take them out.
Right.
And he also he has an archive at the Imperial War Museum, and you start going through it. And I came across a book by an American called The Deceivers by Thaddeus Holt, which is very much the sort of the Bible of all of this. It's quite a dense book. It's not an easy read, but it is, and it's obviously a life's work for Holt, who died some time ago. It is an attempt to list all of the British deception operations or Allied deception operations, and he quite quickly, I think, Holt concluded that once you start looking at this, you pretty much conclude that Clarke is at the root of almost all of them. So it's not quite true to say that nobody had written about Clarke. I think it's fair to say, I felt that sort of Clarke deserved a book of his own, where he appeared on the first page, because I think his story on its own is interesting enough, and actually yes. I think his story is the basis of all of the other deception stuff. So, your listeners may well be familiar with the deception around D-Day, Operation Fortitude, and so on, and that's had quite a few books. They may be familiar with Operation Mincemeat, which is another of these sort of British daring-do operations where a corpse is floated off Spain, supposedly carrying letters that suggest that Britain's next target, the Allies' next target, is not in fact Sicily. And that again is quite well known. I mean, there's a film about that quite recently, and in all of these books, Clarke tends to sort of pop up for about a page,
right?
And in which someone will make a crack about the fact that he'd been arrested dressed as a woman. And it's not quite clear why he's there. And actually, once you start researching him, you realize that he pops up on an awful lot of pages of other people's memoirs. Someone will say, yes, and Dudley Clarke was there, and I never really got to the bottom of what he was doing. And then they will wander on. And so he's this sort of figure. I don't quite know what the equivalent is. It's this figure sort of who's constantly just at the edge of shot.
Yes.
In various other people's stories. And I thought, actually, there's a reason why he is just at the edge of shot in various other people's stories. And perhaps he ought to be at the center of shot in his own story.
Well said.
If that makes sense. So that's how I came across him. And once you start digging into him, he's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, when I figured out, because I knew barely anything about this gentleman. So you're right, you think he's on the edge, but after you go through your book, no, he's at the very center. But the point is not to be noticed at the center. And we're going to see later on in this interview where he actually works with and inspires other deception units. So we'll get to that. So let's bring Clarke into the war, if you will. So it's after Dunkirk. Clearly, the Germans have the initiative. The British need time to rebuild their forces. They've lost a lot of weapons on the beaches of Dunkirk. And Clarke's answer to that, when Sir John Dill, the new chief of the Imperial Staff, asks him, he says, "Could you write something up for me?" Clarke is the perfect person for this, and he does have some very concrete ideas about what to do.
Yes. So the British are in what is for them the unusual position of just losing, and losing badly. They've lost in Norway, and they've lost in France, and they've had to retreat across the Channel. And you've had this retreat at Dunkirk, which is, well, we're jolly glad that we've got all the men back. We kind of wish that they hadn't had to leave all their weapons on the beach.
Right.
And as Churchill says at the time, wars are not won through retreats. Mm-hmm. And Dill is tremendously worried about what he calls the fighting spirit of the British Army, which is, we've got lots of men, but they've spent 6 months being beaten by the Germans, and now we're going to be sitting on our side of the Channel. And what is the army going to do? Because we're not going back to France for quite a while. How are we going to keep these men? How are we going to keep these soldiers feeling like soldiers? Mm-hmm. And Clarke, as I say, Clarke has been thinking about this problem already, and he's been thinking, well, how do other armies act when we beat them? Which, without being arrogant,
right?
That for most of the previous 150 years, that had been the pattern. If the British Army didn't win immediately, it won eventually, which is why it had the empire. And Clarke, as I said, was born in South Africa. So he's sort of well aware of that bit of history. He's been in the Middle East, in what is now Israel, was then called Palestine, where he's been dealing with guerrillas. And so he's got a lot of experience of guerrilla warfare, and actually of how difficult it is for a big army to fight against guerrilla fighters, people who sort of butcher and bolt raids. They pop up, shoot someone, run away. And obviously the forces that Clarke was working with in Palestine were much stronger than the rebels they were fighting against. But it takes time to get your big army to the right place, and by that stage, the people you're trying to fight have disappeared. And Clarke says, "Well, that's what we ought to do. That's what other people do against us. That's what we ought to do." And actually, he already has a name, because Clarke's just an instinctive storyteller, that he knows that this unit will have to have what he calls dash. It will have to seem exciting. Right. And he has a name, the Commandos, which is what the South African rebels, who had been the Boers, who had been fighting against the British, called themselves. And Dill loves the idea. Churchill loves the idea, because Churchill wants to do something. He wants to hit back.
Right.
And actually, it's not difficult to find men who love the idea as well. There'd been something called independent companies before. This isn't a completely original idea. That the Commandos is the version of it that gets going. And Clarke's idea is that what he calls a continual war of mosquito tactics. They'll just keep they'll get some fast boats, nip across the channel, cut a sentry's throat, nip back. Just keep the Germans anxious, keep the Germans worried. You can argue about whether this is actually worthwhile activity, but it's what it's definitely worthwhile for is keeping your own side sort of feeling like they're soldiers, feeling like they're fighting.
Yes.
And they set out to do this. They recruit a genuine movie star, a chap named David Niven, who I hope some of your readers will still be.
Yes,
the listeners will still be familiar with.
Huge fan
with Niven. Niven and Niven, in a sense, is an example of another pirate. Yes. So he joined the army in peacetime and been bored because, peacetime army is bored. So he sort of essentially absconds. I can't quite remember where. Somewhere in the Mediterranean, his unit is, and he absconds and resigns his commission from the boat that's carrying him across the Atlantic and goes to Hollywood and becomes a star. And then when war is declared, it's like, no, that's what I joined the army for. I joined the army to fight.
Right.
So comes straight back. And is assigned to some transport corps by the time he gets back. No, not this. I wanted to fight. So he hears about Clarke's commandos and says, well, we've got room for me. And Clarke, who is slightly celebrity obsessed. It's a celebrity obsessed and obsessed with film.
Sure.
And obsessed with sort of posh people. As Clarke lived his entire life sort of on the fringes of, as it were, properly posh British people. And I think always knowing that he was never quite one of them himself, because although he had, the help of his father's money, he didn't have what we would call breeding. It's sort of, as I say, his father was an adventurer rather than an earl or whatever. Niven is properly posh. And so Clarke is absolutely delighted to have this chap. And when you look at Clarke's memoirs, everyone else in the style of the 1940s writing is referred to by their surname. And Niven is always referred to as David.
Right. I know him. I'm on a first name basis.
Yes,
with
absolutely.
Him. Yeah.
David, my friend David said to me, which of us has not done this? So they set up the commandos, and Churchill is sort of very keen for immediate action. So they do in fact have a raid. They nip across the channel, and they do have a brief sort of firefight. I mean, at the time they say, useful intelligence was gained. The main thing, to be honest, that they learned was all the ways that something like this can go wrong, which,
yes,
don't get me wrong, that is useful information.
Mm-hmm.
And indeed, they could have used more of that kind of information in the coming years, as they'll find out. But it's Clarke is wounded. There's a dispute. It's not clear whether he claimed that his ear was nearly shot off. Another theory is that he fell over in the boat and cut himself. The one thing to be aware of with Clarke is that he is a raconteur.
Yes.
And all of his stories have this sort of, all of his stories that he published, I should say, rather than the secret files, have this kind of, here is a story that I have been telling after dinner for 5 years, sort of polished quality to them. And he did talk about this raid quite a lot in public. So he is wounded in one way or another. They have another raid a couple of weeks later in the Channel Islands, which are these sort of small islands close to France, which are sort of theoretically British territory, but they are British territory, but they've been occupied by the Germans at this point, and that's just a disaster. Everything that could go wrong goes wrong. They end up having to leave men behind because they said they could swim and they couldn't swim, and
wow.
I don't know whether they ended up fighting any Germans. They may have fought each other. It's a mess, and it looks like the commandos are going to be sort of strangled at birth. Nobody can quite work out what they're for. And Churchill, who is quite capricious, is going off the idea of butcher and bolt raids and pinpricks and all of this. He says he wants big operations, and of course the trouble with big operations is that they require sign off. It's very hard to be nimble about a big operation, and you get into this problem where sort of people keep planning things and then someone says, we need too many boats for that, we don't have
right
equipment, we don't have the support, well, you want to send 100 men here, or what, So Clarke spends the tail end of 1940 sort of involved in these arguments and quite worried that the commandos are going to be killed off. They're not, in fact. The commandos are still exist today, and they are one of Britain's elite special forces, and they will become the model for. Explicitly, they are the model for the U.S. Army Rangers. The early Ranger units go and train with the commandos. The reason why special forces units all over the world wear green berets is because of the commandos.
Wow.
I imagine they're the reason that the Green Berets wear the green berets.
And they look good.
And this idea of sort of small units of independently thinking men is the point. The point of the commandos is that rather than being the sort of the standard British Army soldier who goes where he's told, eats when he's told, eats what he's given, shoots where he's told, the commando will be his own man, who will be able to be dropped behind enemy lines, think on his feet, and achieve results. Which it's a really sort of, at the time, it's an innovative idea in the British Army. Now I think it's obviously sort of much more accepted across militaries that you need these people.
Right. That's if I could just real quick, that's what gets me whenever I'm talking to someone about either World War II or whatever. It's like, if you assume something, don't forget it had to originate somewhere. And for something like this is Clarke. This is people who think like Clarke, and he does go on to inspire. And you're right. It's the British can't land on the mainland, not anytime soon. But like you said, morale is low. We have to give the soldiers something to do. We have to be seen resisting. And so the next point of this is at least, it's North Africa. It's to protect Egypt, because clearly the Italians are gunning for that. And if the British lose Egypt and they lose the Nile, and they lose the channel. It's just
the Suez Canal.
Exactly, Suez. That's what I was completely blanking on that.
Right. So Suez is hugely important in the British mind.
Yes.
It's because it's the shortcut from the Mediterranean out to out towards India. And India is the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. And if you can send ships down the Suez Canal, they can get to India much faster. So control of the canal has always been, at this point, central to the British imperial mindset. there is a live question about how useful a canal actually is in World War II when the Mediterranean is patrolled by Italian submarines.
Right.
And actually, the Navy is reluctant to send transports and supply ships through the Med because it's so dangerous. So a lot of the ships, even the ships that are going to Egypt, end up taking this long route round the bottom of Africa and up the other side. So there is a sort of, as with a lot of the things in the war, there's a sort of, well, was this actually really worth all of the effort that you spent on it kind of question that nobody asks at the time, and that we, at 80 years distant say, would it have been a disaster if we'd lost the Suez Canal? I'm not sure it would have been as much of a disaster. It would have felt like a disaster.
Exactly.
And Egypt is technically neutral. It has a treaty with the British that allow the British to defend Egypt, and I'm sort of using "defend" in quotes there,
right.
Because in effect, what this means is that Egypt is neutral, but there is a huge British Empire army sitting in Egypt, and the Egyptian king sort of has to do what he's told by the British ambassador, and this creates all sorts of tensions, and indeed sort of will have post-war ramifications of India has its own revolution. A palace coup by military officers, many of whom have spent World War II sitting there looking at all these British officers sort of swanning around Cairo like they own the place and thinking, do you know what? I'm not sure. I'm not sure we need or want these people.
Right.
But for our purposes, Britain has decided that the defence of Egypt matters. The other advantage of defending Egypt is that it is a place where you can fight your enemy that is not your home soil. And there is something of a British tradition of sort of fighting your enemy somewhere else.
Yes.
Not necessarily on their soil, not necessarily on your soil, but look, here's Egypt. It's fantastic. It's largely empty. Because it's all desert, there's not a huge sort of civilian population to worry about. Why don't we get them to go there and we'll go there and we can slug it out there, sort of thing.
Exactly.
And that's to what extent this is by design and to what extent this is something that's just ended up happening. The British are initially fighting the Italians, who have decided that Africa is going to be their empire. And the thing is, if you're going to have an empire in Africa in the middle of the 20th century, you're either going to have to take it off the French or you're going to have to take it off the British.
Right.
And the Italians are trying to do a little bit of both. But, the British are the obvious people to take it off because we had a lot of it.
Exactly. So you make the point that Egypt, if we can take away all the niceties for a second, it's a pretty much occupied country. There's a lot of British or allied forces there, but again, they are defending it from the Nazis. Now, before I read your book, I don't think I fully appreciated how very much different life in Cairo was compared to London. The word holiday probably goes too far, but there were many of life's pleasures to be had in Cairo. It was a world away from those who were suffering in London and in the surrounding areas.
Absolutely. In London, you've got rationing, you've got the blackout where the streets have to be unlit at night. And so it's for a lot of the year, it's cold and it's dark and there isn't very much to eat. And what there is to eat is not very nice. Right. And there's shortages of everything. And then you get out to Cairo and there isn't rationing in Cairo, and there's lots of supplies of lots of things. I mean, the booze is not top quality, but there's a lot of it. And there's butter, there's food, there's things like that.
Right.
There is also, for quite a lot of the soldiers, quite a lot of sex, because you're far from home, and the Egyptian sort of attitude, certainly before the war breaks out, the attitude of British people in Cairo has long been a bit of sort of doesn't count on location.
Right.
Like
in Vegas.
Go out. Yes, yeah. What happens in Cairo stays in Cairo, unless you bring an infection back with you.
Oh yeah.
And so Cairo is licentious.
Mm-hmm.
There's belly dancing. There are also, because it's only a couple of days from the front for quite a lot of the war.
Right.
There are also lots of men who are sort of back from the front briefly, who've just seen their friends die, who think they might die the next time they go out, and that lends your life a certain sort of urgency.
Yes.
And it's full of it's full of young men and women. And there's lots of young English women out there as well, sort of in support roles, who are a long way from home at a time when the world is on fire. And so as one of Clarke's colleagues who was in charge of internal security put it, people misbehaved themselves all over the place.
Right. So you've got this very different world, and I can't remember if it was Dill or if it's General Wavell, the CNC Middle East, that decides, hey, someone like Clarke, with his imagination, with the way he thinks, is the point of view that he has, he would be perfect here. So Operation Compass, which I've covered, takes place. The Italians are pushed back, but Wavell now wants to focus on East Africa, but he's only got so many forces. He needs the Italians to be caught off guard, because even when he sends his men in, they will resist, and he doesn't want to lose any more men than he has to. Could you describe Operation Camilla for us concerning East Africa?
So this is Archibald Wavell, who is one of Britain's creative generals. And a poet as well, or a lover of poetry. He sort of compiles a collection of poetry in the middle of the war, which is still in print. And indeed, for many people these days, that's the thing they've heard of.
Right.
He has this idea to use deception as a force multiplier. And he's already done a little bit of this, and he sends a cable to London saying, "I would like Clarke, please." And that tells you two things. First of all, Wavell gets what he wants at this point in the war. Apart from this, he's the only person who is fighting the enemy in a big way. And the second thing it tells you is how highly rated Clarke was, because Wavell, the man who is the one man fighting the enemy, the one man who gets what he wants, this is what he wants. He's worked with Clarke before the war in the Middle East. He's decided that Clarke is a different thinker, and that's what he needs. He needs a sort of a creative sideways thinker.
Right.
And Clarke arrives and is immediately set to work by Wavell, who says, I'm about to head into Sudan, and I would very much like the Italians who took Sudan off the English the previous year. I would like them to be in the wrong place when I attack. And I would like them, we're going to go over the land, and I would like them to think that we're making an amphibious landing from across the Persian Gulf. So Clarke sets about sort of telling this story of Britain building up its forces in Aden, on the other side of the Gulf. He goes out and he orders maps, and when troops are being sent down the Suez Canal, he makes sure that they've got enough food on board to get them all the way to Aden. He something that actually becomes a bit controversial later in the war. He has postal deliveries redirected to Aden for particular units. That's something they didn't do again because because post is so important to morale. Letters from home. Yeah. The one rule that they impose is don't mess about with that, please. Right. And he very carefully sort of crafts this story of a large British force that is about to make an amphibious landing, and it works in the sense that the Italians believe it. And it also doesn't work because the Italians, believing that a large amphibious landing is coming, decide we can't fight that. And so they retreat and put their army by accident in the way in the way of the real British army that is coming over the land.
Oh, right.
So it's a complete success, and it's a total failure because they got the enemy to believe what they wanted him to believe, but then he did the opposite. And
right.
this incredibly important lesson. It takes Clarke a while to figure it out, but the lesson is it doesn't matter what the enemy thinks; it's what he does.
Yes.
And all the way through the war, whenever Clarke is trying to discuss deception with generals and says, "Well, what would you like me to achieve?" They will always say, "Well, what I'd like Hitler to think that we're going over here." And Clarke says, "It doesn't matter what he thinks.
Right.
Matters what he does."
Right.
And you to get them to it's a slightly different. It's a difficult mental trick, but here is a great example of why you have to do it because the Italians thought the right thing, but they did the wrong thing.
Exactly. And this, I really enjoy this part of your book because between the Channel Islands, between the post that you just mentioned a second ago, this is a learning experience. There's a learning curve. Yes, we can manipulate, we can deceive, but at the end of the day, it's what the enemy does or does not do that dominates whether it's a success or failure. So he's still learning. Having said that, and I'm going to jump ahead a little bit for the listeners, now comes Clarke's nemesis, or at least that's how I thought of him, Rommel. So Rommel comes in, he's going to be dynamic, he's going to catch Berlin and London and Rome off guard with how proactive he is. But the hardest thing for Clarke is, here he is, he's kind of honing his craft, and now here's a man who doesn't really listen to anybody except for his own eyes and ears. He flies his own reconnaissance planes. This is going to be one of, I guess, to me, Clarke's greatest challenge to convince Rommel to think something other than what he sees.
Absolutely. So Rommel arrives in Africa. Rommel's arrival in Africa is a sign of British success.
Yes,
because the British have been pushing the Italians back to the point where Hitler says, "I can't let my ally lose there. I can't let Britain get control of the Mediterranean, which if they have control of North Africa, then they obviously that sets them up to, indeed it does set them up to do what they eventually do, which is head up into Italy." So Hitler sends Rommel, who is his favorite general at this point, one of his favorite generals, to help the Italians out. And Rommel has made a name for himself in France by just charging ahead. He's grasped tank tactics in a way that very few people have, both sort of in terms of how to take tanks on,
right,
and in terms of how to use them. And one of the things that has worked for Rommel incredibly successfully is just always be going forward.
Yes.
When you've got your enemy off guard. I mean, in France, classically, you've got your enemy off balance. They don't know what's going on. Just keep going forward. Don't worry about your supply lines. Don't worry about what's behind you. He's very like Patton in this. I think that his view is see the enemy, go after the enemy, and I mean, I think I get the impression there were quite a few generals who are like this. It doesn't work for all of them. It works for Rommel.
Right.
And he arrives in Africa and almost immediately tilts the balance, because the thing about Africa is it's a killer on your logistics chain. And the desert destroys men and it destroys machinery, even without, shooting any of them. If you get lost in the desert, you'll die. Yes. If you keep driving a truck across the desert, it will break down, because sand gets into things, they get short of water. So the British have chased the Italians into Libya, out of Egypt, and they've kind of got about as far as they can get before all of their stuff starts breaking down. And they've paused because they've reached the sort of their culmination point, I think. Right. The military theoreticians call it. Basically, it's as far as you can get without losing everything behind you, and they think their view is, oh, we're only dealing with the Italians, and we've been kicking them back and back. This is fine. But take a rest, take a breather, fix our tanks, and the next thing they know, they are running back the other way.
Yes.
Because Rommel has arrived with fresh tanks, and the pattern of the Desert War, it's referred to by a lot of people as the pendulum of war, because it keeps swinging back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1941, the British will charge west, and then they will retreat east, and then they charge west again, and then in 1942 they will retreat east again, and then fight. And actually you keep seeing the same places coming up. So the defense of Tobruk. It is a lot of these places I feel are probably more familiar to British ears than they are to Americans, because this is sort of where the British are fighting, and there are war films about these things. Did you know you have, when you're talking about the siege of Tobruk, the defense of Tobruk, you have to say, are we talking about 1941 or are we talking about 1942?
Exactly.
And even writing it, you're sitting there going, oh, hang on.
What year am I in?
Which and it's actually really odd, because pretty much the same thing will happen to the British again at the start of 1942 as happens to them at this point in 1941, where they get to pretty much the same place and they think, we've done it, lads. Everybody sit down, and then they get chased back again by Rommel, and the same thing happens again the next year. So Clarke's job in 41 is, what can we do to deceive Rommel? What can we do to give him pause?
Mm-hmm.
And he is, as you say, he is still learning the tricks of the trade, learning how to do this job that he's been given. And almost his problem is that he's working with a general like Wavell, who is a careful, thoughtful man who, Wavell is deeply conscious that when he makes a mistake, men die.
Right.
And Wavell is the kind of general who worries about his supply lines. So the British are saying, well, maybe we can create some threats to Rommel's supply lines that will slow him down. But Rommel doesn't care. Rommel doesn't think like that. Rommel's view is, well, if we just get to Tobruk, the supplies will be there.
Yeah.
So just keep driving, men. Keep going forward. Right. And and that works for him. By the way, again, it doesn't work for everyone. It works for him. Mm-hmm. It drives. I get the impression it slightly drives Rommel's own officers a bit mad, because they're sitting there saying, "I don't know, sir. The lads are quite tired, and I don't. I'm looking at the water ration, and Rommel's just saying, no, it's all there. If we just get there,
it's ahead of us.
Get there quickly, all of these problems will go away." And yes, Rommel has a professional soldier's skepticism of intelligence. Mm-hmm. So you can slowly sort of whisper things to German spies or whatever, but Rommel isn't necessarily listening. Particularly, if Rommel can see that the British tanks in front of him are running away, you are going to struggle to persuade him that he shouldn't go after them.
Exactly,
because that is his nature. And they do struggle, to be honest. It takes them a long time to work out how to deceive Rommel. And I think it's probably fair to say that certainly in the first half of 41, the only thing that's slowing Rommel down is the desert.
Yes.
Before the British sort of finally got, again, what tends to happen is that Rommel has his own culmination point problem somewhere sort of between Tobruk and Cairo each time, where he just can't. Got to understand as well that when we talk about all of this stuff being brought up, it's all being brought up on a not very good road, that sort of a small desert road that was not designed for tanks or huge amounts of traffic to be going over it. Right. So the road is being destroyed and is destroying vehicles and so on in turn. This fight back and forth is taking place.
Yeah. Now, and you're right, because Rommel, he knows that all will be forgiven if he wins. He can defy orders as long as he's winning. Hitler's going to go, that's my boy, and everything's going to be fine. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. Yeah, so you're right. The fighting goes back and forth, and you literally do have to remember what year you're reading, or it gets very confusing. And Rommel eventually takes Tobruk. He's now pushing on Egypt proper. And and this is one of the many things that I enjoyed about your book. You give the more full story, if you will. Rommel's an amazing general. He's an amazing tactician. He's very bold. He's very brave. He's often almost killed himself a couple of times, but he is reading the British mail, if you will, because as he's going along and as he's getting closer and closer to Egypt, to El Alamein, he does have access to a lot of British, intelligence through one gentleman called Bonner Fellers. If you could tell us about him, and I will try not to scream as you're talking, but basically Rommel was reading the cards in the British hands.
Yes. So are there any Americans in your story, Rob? There are Americans in my story, yes. And there is there's Colonel Bonner Fellers. Yeah. I think that you can make a case that Bonner Fellers, who is the American military attaché in Cairo, is the single most effective spy in the entire war.
Yes.
Unfortunately, really unfortunately, because he doesn't think he's a spy.
Right.
And to be fair to him, he would have been appalled. I don't know what stage he's told, but it would have been appalling to him to discover that he'd been a spy. Unfortunately for him, he is unconsciously a spy for the Germans.
Right.
So by middle of 1942, America has entered the war, and thank goodness, and is supplying equipment principally in the Middle East. So it's not so much about men there, though there are some US soldiers. It's mainly tanks and bits. And these are enormously important to the British. And the most important man, therefore, in Cairo in lots of ways is Bonner Fellers, who is the American military attaché in Cairo, who is a person who sort of sits there and says how things are going. And his reports are going to Roosevelt's desk. And it's very important for the British to keep Bonner Fellers on side. And there are lots of ways in which Bonner Fellers is an ideal kind of man for the job. He's affable, he's urbane. It's clear reading some of the diaries that a lot of the women rather liked him, this sort of suave American, sort of turning up to charm them all and being, often kind and helpful and so on as well.
Right.
And the British officers like the fact that that he keeps, as they see it, keeps sending them tanks. Unfortunately, first unfortunate thing is that he despises the British army.
Yes.
And this is, I have to say, slightly with the arrogance of somebody whose soldiers have not yet met the Germans.
True. Sitting
there and saying, well, I'm sure that this would all be a lot easier if we were doing it. And I just think this must be what all soldiers are like everywhere. That they sit there and these limeys, they don't know what they're doing. There is some evidence that when American soldiers first meet Rommel, he turns out to be a bit of a tougher nut to crack than they had appreciated.
Oh yes.
But all of that is in the future, and Bonner Fellers is sure he's right about this. What he doesn't know, his job is to report firsthand what's going on, and he's very good at it because he's a soldier and because he's got access. What he doesn't know is that the Germans have broken the American diplomatic code.
Right.
So it's a cunning embassy heist in Rome at the end of 41, and the Italians get hold of the German code book. The American code book, and then the Germans through that are able to open it. So everything is being read.
Wow.
And the British start to think that the German, because the British obviously are reading the German codes.
Yes.
And the British code breakers at Bletchley Park become aware that Rommel has got a source of information that is referred to as the good source. And it's not quite clear what the good source is. Is that broken codes? Is that an individual? What is it? But they are in the sort of middle of 42. They are conducting a very, very secret hunt to try to work out what Rommel's source is, because Rommel, recognizes, although I said he was sniffy about intelligence, he recognizes that what he is getting from Bonnefellas is terrific stuff, because Bonnefellas is going everywhere and he's got a soldier's eye. Mm-hmm. So that's what you most want, is someone who says that they're very weak here, or this gun doesn't really work very well in the desert, or these tanks aren't tremendously effective. I mean, actually, Bonnefellas is quite rude about US Grant tanks as well. Right. They're not very effective against German tanks. Oh, well, that's interesting. We'll have a bit of that. Right. So Rommel is getting this stuff passed to him as fast as possible. They reckon that Rommel is reading it before Roosevelt's reading it.
Wow.
And which is not true of all code. We sort of have this idea that all the codes were just being broken easily all the time, and very often with Enigma stuff, you were breaking stuff sort of a month after it had been sent, and it was interesting but no longer useful.
Right.
Rommel is getting this stuff absolutely, as it's coming out, and he's got this fantastic wireless intelligence unit that likes to go right up the front, and the British, it has to be said, are terrible at radio security.
Yes.
They are not used to using voice radio, where you speak as you and I are speaking rather than Morse code, and they use one genuine bit of British subterfuge is at one stage over the radio they refer to capital of England as a code for London. And it's like, well, I think the Germans might be able to crack that one.
A work in progress.
So this very good radio unit is going up there, and that's learned sort of to recognise the different British units by their radio chatter and so on. And so Rommel is. Rommel is, in intelligence terms, his intelligence officer said afterwards, he's become like a man accustomed to going around in daylight.
Yes,
he can just see everything, and he's getting this tremendous stuff from Bonnefellas, and it's a real crisis. I mean, the British in Cairo, when the word comes through that they've got a leak, which is even that is a sensitive thing to communicate, they immediately look at Bonnefellas because they think, you know. Which is probably prejudice, but let's face it. Sometimes just because it's prejudice, it's not wrong, and this is an occasion,
right?
Where the sort of the national rivalry is the right one, and they try to restrict Bonnefellas' access to information, and they say to Bonnefellas, I should offer a partial defense of Bonnefellas. He is worried because he senses, as I say, he's not a stupid man. When the British say to him, could you please be a bit more discreet in your cables? He thinks, hang on, what do they know? What are they not telling me?
Right.
And he seeks assurances from Washington that the code has not been broken. And Washington say, it's all secure. It's all fine. And in fact, I think shortly after this, someone at Bletchley Park has this incredibly sensitive job of telling the Americans that their codes have been broken. And of course, it's not just, I mean, the one the British are worried about is Bonnefellas, but for the Americans, it's everything. So, don't forget, you've got a man in Moscow who is liaising with Stalin. And what's his stuff is being broken. Everybody's stuff is being broken. Right. So, and further complicating all of this is that the British don't want to reveal that they know that the code has been broken, because they're trying to protect Enigma. So there's a sort of, we would like you to stop, we would like you to fix your code, but also can you be a bit circumspect about how you do this? What you can't do is send a sort of an emergency all stations broadcast that says the Germans are reading everything, because the Germans know that you're doing. If the Germans pick that up, then they might start to wonder where the leak is on their side. So there's this dance as Rommel is getting ready. This is middle of 42. He's just hit the line, the British defensive line at El Alamein, which is not very far at all. It's sort of less than a day's drive from Cairo, and there's panic in Cairo. People are piling onto trains. The British embassy is burning all its documents. Clarke's team are burning all of their documents. People are worried about how they're going to get out.
Right.
And at this point, the code is changed, and again, Rommel's intelligence chief says, he's gone. The Rommel goes from being like a man used to walking around in daylight to suddenly a man in darkness, because by an unfortunate coincidence, at the same time as this happens, his wireless unit goes too far forward and is killed. Killed and captured. So suddenly Rommel loses all of his intelligence. Bonifeller's is redeployed and ends up is sent back to Washington. I think slightly, not exactly in disgrace, but the British say we don't want him anymore. Right. And I think the British may at this point have started to. They have now begun reading some of his messages, as it were, via the Germans. And they just think, he was a badly behaved house guest, and you can have him back. I mean, he ends up in Japan, I think, after the war. There is a film in which he's a key figure, but so some of your listeners may know more about him in the what I would think of as the Far East context, right? Because he goes on, and he goes on, to do other things, but he moves off the scene from the Middle East.
Right. Well, he certainly isn't the first arrogant American. We'll leave that part right there. But you make a good point, because Rommel might have lost the good source. He might have lost that wireless team that was being very brave, like you said, going right up to the front, doing stellar work. But he is, like you said, a day's drive from Cairo. So this is very real. So, and again, we're skipping entire chapters, because that part that you just described, again, to me, that was like 12-dimensional chess. And I'll leave that for the readers to enjoy, because I certainly enjoyed how Bletchley and London had to deal with that conundrum. So there's now Monty on the scene. There's now Harold Alexander, the CNC, on the scene. And Monty needs time. So Monty's getting reinforced. I think he's getting some American equipment as well. Monty's getting ready to go. But as you say in the book, this is a wide open, flat area. Not a lot of deception seems possible in this, but Monty needs to go forward. And again, no one wants to fight Rommel on a fair footing. I mean, you're going to bleed if you do. So if you could describe for us, and this is for me, and I'm sure this is the way you probably saw it as well, this is the big payoff. This would be the final 30 minutes of the movie or whatever, the big sleight of hand that Clarke and others are able to put together to trick Rommel as far as where the real attack is going. Could you set that up for us, please?
Absolutely. I mean, there was a point when I was writing the book where I thought I should just end it after Alamein. And then I thought I kind of have to do 1943 and 1944. But I did absolutely. I know what you mean. Yeah. So I'll just describe the scene quickly. Although the desert is huge, actually the bit of the desert on which you can fight is quite small. Because the Mediterranean is to the north, and there's this vast area called the Guitarra Depression, which is essentially impassable to tanks. It's certainly some people are going across it in small numbers, but it's you can't get an armored army across it. So actually, an awful lot of the Desert War is fought in this sort of 40, 50 mile strip next to the coast. And that's why the defense, the British choose, as Rommel is advancing, they choose this line south of a very small town called El Alamein to be their defensive line, because that's where it narrows. So we can hold them there. and they successfully hold them there in the summer, partly actually because Bonifellas was wrong about Grant tanks. They were better than he thought they were.
Right.
And Rommel can't get through. And then you have months of Allied build-up as the Allies think, right, well, we have to go the other way. But of course, Rommel knows what's coming, so he's doing his own build-up. And suddenly what you get is something that looks an awful lot like the Great War. You know, sort of two sides with trenches and minefields and lots of artillery facing each other, and somebody's got to work out a way to break through. And to be honest, you don't have a lot of options. You can either go south or you can go north.
Right.
You know, that's it. There's no secret trick to this. Rommel has tried to go south and has failed, partly because of an Allied deception operation that wasn't a Clarke one, but it may have been inspired. It was done by people who'd worked with Clarke, so it may have been inspired by their work with him. Monty wants to go north. North is the obvious way to go because the road, such as it is north. The going is better for tanks. The ground is harder in the north. So north is the way that Monty wants to go. He wants to go at night. Which means he has to go because he's going to be trying to get men through minefields at night. He has to go at a full moon, so that the sappers will have enough light to clear these minefields. So actually, you can pretty quickly narrow down, you know, when he's going to go, and as I say, in terms of where he's going to go, it's left hand or right hand. There's he's got limited options. But Monty calls Clarke in. Clarke is now running an organization called A-Force, which is British deception in the Middle East and beyond. And he's been running it. He's now on his third set of commanders. After Wavell, there's Auchinleck. After Auchinleck, there's Alexander. And each one passes Clarke on and clearly says, you know, this chap's worth keeping.
Right.
And so Monty says, right, well, what can you do for me? I want to take Rommel by surprise. And, you know, the people who are drawing this up for Monty, I think, raise their eyebrows slightly at this because one of them says it's all horribly obvious.
Right.
You know, we're going the obvious way at the obvious time. And Clarke says, okay, well, here's some things we've learned. We've learned that you can do deception about time. So one of the interesting things that Clarke has discovered over the previous year is that actually, if you keep saying, "Oh, an attack is imminent," if you sort of build up to an attack, and then a couple of days beforehand you say, "Oh, it's off,"
right?
That has this psychological effect on the enemy that they get used to being keyed up and then stood down, and actually it becomes harder for them to come back to alert. Even when that makes no sense, because, you know, look, an attack is coming. The fact that the attack didn't come last time doesn't mean that this attack won't come. But it's when you get a lot of false alarms.
Yeah.
The way I always think of this is when my wife was pregnant with our first child, we had a couple of sort of false alarm labours, and I started to think, oh, the baby's never going to come. You know, and obviously that's not true. So obviously that is not true, and in fact, each one that's a failed one makes the next one more likely to be true. But the effect it has in your mind,
yes,
is that you think, oh, this is, you know, we've done this. We've got in the car in the middle of the night before, and nothing happened. And,
I'm giving up.
Yeah, and that is how Clarke does this to the German soldiers. Oh, yeah, well, again, you know that's. And he gets he calls it crying wolf.
Oh, I like that.
So they will build up. So he says, well, we can do that. We can sort of build up to an attack that doesn't happen. We can spread. We can do a lot of stuff that makes it look like an attack isn't coming. So he gets men who are at the front to send telegrams back to Cairo, booking hotel rooms for the full moon period. Which, the thing about Cairo is everyone's got an angle. Okay, yes. So it's it's a great place to spread false rumors because there's a very good chance that things will get back to someone, and because it's neutral for a lot of the war. For instance, until Japan comes into the war, the Japanese have a consulate in Cairo, and the British know that some of the Japanese people there are definitely spies, and that they're definitely supplying stuff to the Germans, and they think, well, that's great, we'll use that.
Yes.
We can't get rid of them, we'll use them. If you sort of assume it's not unreasonable to assume that a piece of paper dropped in a Cairo hotel will make its way to somebody. So they book hotel rooms. They organize a conference for very senior generals in what's now Iran. Right. That again is going to take place just after the attack is supposed to be happening, and they know that this information will get through to the Germans because the other thing that Clarke's team has achieved is that they have complete control of certainly the known spies in Cairo. So with the loss of Bonifellas, German intelligence is looking about who else have we got, and they've got one. Well, he doesn't even exist. It's quite complicated to explain. They've got one source who has been created by the British,
right?
Who is a source who is known to the Germans as Paul Nikozov, which is a joke.
Yes.
It's a dirty joke. Because knickers is the British expression for what Americans would call panties,
right?
And a German agent who was working for the British said to the Germans, "I have this man in Cairo, and he's called Paul Nikozov." And the British then sort of desperately running around trying to sort of create a backstory for this name. Oh, well, he's a bit Russian. Right. His father Slavic. And they're sitting there the whole time going, "This is just a dirty joke." I wish he hadn't done that, but there you are. But the Germans don't notice it. So,
right.
And this guy Nikozov, who doesn't exist, but there is a British radio operator who is pretending to be him, and the Germans, for want of anyone else, are using him. They decide that they might as well believe him because they don't have anyone else. And he is sending all of this stuff night after night. He is the longest running double agent operation of World War II.
Wow.
He's going right from 41 until the end of the war. And passing all sorts of stuff, but particularly around this time, he is passing intelligence that supposedly, this imaginary agent has got an imaginary girlfriend who knows lots of Allied officers and pilots and so on, and he's passing on what she's telling him. It's all sort of it's all a wilderness of mirrors, but Clarke is fairly confident that he can put over the idea that, look, it's not going to be the full moon in October.
Right.
And then the other thing you can do is you can say, well, what can we do to conceal these troops? And you are talking about hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of tanks, thousands of guns. And you're talking about the desert, which has very little in the way of sort of conceal. I mean, this stuff... These are forces that it will be hard to conceal in Europe, if you see what I mean.
Yes.
But where there is vegetation, it is impossible, is the view, to conceal them in the desert. And yet Monty says he'd like them to have a try. And working with Clarke is a man called Geoffrey Barkas, who was a filmmaker before the war, and he's assembled this team in Egypt of artistic types. I mean, one of the interesting things about the war is that although you've got people like Clarke who are professional soldiers, there's an awful lot of people who aren't professional soldiers who've sort of come in, they've been conscripted or they've joined up because they want to help, and they might not be necessarily terribly good at fighting, but a lot of them have got transferable skills. And Barkas has been going around finding all of the artists.
Right. And
getting them to do camouflage work. And his view is actually you can conceal a lot more than you think you can conceal, even in the desert. And you can sort of... His view is that you can either make things look like other things, or you can... basically you can make everything look like something else, or you can make it look like nothing. Because he says the eye looks for patterns. So, and he's been champing at the bit to have a crack at doing something, and this is his great opportunity. And they devise what I say, and I think I would defend this, is the biggest magic trick in history.
Right.
And they, over a series of nights in advance of the attack, what they do is they assemble the sort of the attacking force away back from the line and kind of in the middle, so that it can go, as I say, either north or south. And they leave it there. And they know that the German Air Force is flying reconnaissance missions, so we leave it there, we let them see it. They start building what looks like a water pipeline towards the southern end of the front. And that this is both a deception about location and time, because they're building it very slowly. So it's going south and it's not ready.
Right.
And they are very quietly at night squirreling away supplies at the northern end of the line. So I mean, the thing about the desert is there's nothing there for you to live off. So if you want to eat something or you want to drink something, you've got to take it with you, or it's got to be there in advance.
Right.
And so and one of the reasons why the Germans are confident that Monty can't launch a surprise attack is because all of these supplies will have to be there. So they stack the boxes and boxes of crates of supplies in the shape of 3-ton trucks, and then cover them with camouflage netting. And they do this each night, and they check. They're really rigorous about this. From the air, this looks like a truck.
Wow.
And it close up, it's not fooling anyone, but no one's getting close up.
Right.
And there are various other tricks they do to conceal things, but basically, all of this stuff is there, and then over a series of nights, they start moving the tanks up to their staging area in the north. And when the tanks get to that staging area, what they find, each tank has a location to go to, and what it finds there is what's called a sun shield, which is basically a cover for a tank that makes a tank look like a 3-ton truck.
Oh.
And you can bolt this on.
Right.
And that's sitting there on barrels, and it's been sitting there for ages. So the Germans are used to seeing that cover there that looks like a 3-ton truck. And at night, you drive your tank up, you bolt this over the top.
Right.
You squirrel back into your tank, and when the sun comes up next behind you, by the way, the Royal Engineers have been going sweeping away your tracks.
Right.
Back where you were, in the place that you have vacated, somebody has assembled dummy tanks made of bits of beds, made of wood and canvas, whatever they could find, things that they just have to look like tanks from a distance.
Right.
And when the sun comes up and those reconnaissance flights take off, it looks like nothing has changed.
Patterns.
And they do this over a series of nights.
Right.
Until on the morning of October the 23rd, I think it's 23rd, the army is assembled. It's assembled at the front line, and the German intelligence report that day is nothing to report. We haven't seen anything.
Wow.
Nothing of interest. And that night, just before 10 o'clock, the British guns open up with certainly the largest gunnery offensive that has happened in a desert, possibly at that stage in the war, possibly at that stage in history, actually thinking about it. These huge assault of guns, and the Germans are taken completely by surprise. They are taken so by surprise that Rommel is not even in the right continent.
Right.
This is how we know it worked. Rommel is recuperating in the Alps. He's gone back because the no British attack is imminent, and you know what? We'll see it before it comes. So he can say to his team, look, when you see them moving their tanks up and bringing the supplies up, give me a phone and I'll hop back.
Wow.
But they don't see it.
Right.
It takes the Germans 2 or 3 days to even decide, because there's a feint in the south and a big attack is in the north. And obviously, if you're in the way of the big attack, you've got a pretty good idea that this is the big attack. But on the other hand, you're busy fighting, and your lines of communication are destroyed. Rommel's deputy dies of a heart attack after coming under fire. So there's no command and control. It takes the Germans about 3 days to work out even where Monty's thrust is.
Right.
If you see what I mean? And that's enough time. I think it's really important to say that this battle was won by really hard fighting.
Yes.
And and it was still an incredibly hard fight because there's no way of getting around the fact you were going through built-up defenses.
Right.
So it wasn't won by Dudley Clarke, and it wasn't won by his team. But does it help? Excuse me, sorry. Does it help that Rommel is in the wrong country? Yes, it definitely helps.
Yes.
Does it help that the Germans are taken completely by surprise? It definitely helps. And that's just the edge that that the deceivers are able to give to Monty, is that he is able to pull off what no one thought was possible, which is a surprise attack in the desert.
Wow. I'm glad you said that, because you're right. It certainly comes down to the fighting, to the bravery and the courage and the professionalism of the soldiers. At the same time, all is fair in love and war. And if you can get anything, any kind of advantage, or in this case, a very big advantage, obviously you would want to do that, because there's going to be a lot more fighting after this. Mr. Hutton, thank you very much for this book, and thank you for your time. And I want to let the listeners know the book goes on from here. As you mentioned, there's Crete and there's Cyprus and there's other things that go on. But Mr. Clarke certainly did his part. I'd say he did an outsized part in helping the Allies be eventual victors. For everybody out there, the book is called The Illusionist, The True Story of the Man Who Fooled Hitler. Mr. Hutton, thank you very much for this book, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. It's been great fun.